So what we're going to do now in this video is look at Australia's current account deficit and ask the question, why has Australia had a current account deficit for most of the last 50 years? So Australia's current account deficit really commenced in the early 1970s, and the size of the deficit, both in absolute terms and relative to GDP, that is as a percentage of GDP, increased right through to about 2019. Then in 2019, 2020, 21 onwards, Australia moved into some current account surpluses. So what I'm going to do is ignore the more recent current account surpluses and focus on why Australia has had a current account deficit for most of its history since the early to mid 1970s. So we've got this diagram here, and what I'm going to assume is that when Australia runs a current account deficit, it also is in a situation where net exports are less than zero. That is, if it's running a current account deficit, it's also running a trade deficit. Now, strictly speaking, that's not true. If we go back to this data, for example, and have a look at 2008, 2009, we can see that in that year, Australia had a current account deficit of $39.78 billion, but it actually had a trade surplus, which the trade surplus is the balance on goods and services, the balance on that category, of a surplus of $7.622 billion. So it's possible to have a positive level of net exports, but a current account deficit overall if your primary income deficit is large enough. It's unlikely that the secondary income deficit will be so large to be able to make this true because there's very small items recorded in secondary income. But if you have a lot of foreign obligations as a country and you pay in net terms a lot of interest payments and dividend payments in net terms to foreigners, that is pay them more interest and dividend payments than they pay you. So if you have a deficit in net terms, then it is possible for that deficit to overwhelm a positive trade balance and give you a current account balance overall. But most of the time, if a country has a current account deficit, it'll also have a trade deficit. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So we'll go back to this very last slide here. Okay, so this is the case of Australia, and what I'm assuming is that we are representing the Australian economy over a particular year, and we're representing that economy, the Australian economy, as being at point A. At point A, the values of NX are minus 50 billion, and the value of S minus I is 50 billion, which is exactly what I've got here. Now, what I'm also assuming is that the value of net exports equals the value of the current account. And I'm saying that net exports are minus 50 billion. And so therefore I'm sort of waving my hands in the air and assuming that that also means the current account deficit is 50 billion as well. So NX being minus 50 billion, that's a trade deficit of 50 billion. But I'm also assuming that the current account deficit is also 50 billion. In doing that, what I'm actually assuming is that the balance on primary income is zero and the balance on secondary income is zero as well. So that NX, which is the goods and services balance, equals the current account balance. You can only have that if the primary income balance and the secondary income balance are equal to zero as well. So why am I doing that? Just like previous videos, for simplicity. Okay, it's quite convenient, and we'll see this in the applications and in tutorials, for me to be able to use the terms net exports, which is the balance on goods and services, or alternatively, it's called the trade balance. It's convenient to be able to assume that that balance and the current account balance are the same value. Even though it's not true in reality, what you're seeing here is the real numbers. But by assuming for simplicity that the balance on goods and services and the current account balance are both the same value, then it's going to be much easier as we move forward. So effectively what I'm doing is I'm taking this primary income balance of minus 49.496 billion and the primary income surplus of 0.09 billion, and I'm taking those numbers and putting them up into goods and services to give me a goods and service deficit of 74.25 billion as well. So I'm just assuming that they don't exist, these numbers, these categories, they're all zero, and I'm taking the values and putting them up there into goods and services. Why am I doing that? Simply so that I can assume that net exports, which is the goods and services balance, and the current account balance, which is the top line, are the same value. Why am I doing that? Because it's convenient in the model to be able to switch between NX and current account balance when we're using this theoretical model to explain what might be going on in the real world. Okay, so I'm just doing that for simplicity. So that allows me to then say, at point A, we've got net exports of minus 50 billion, or we've got a current account deficit of 50 billion as well. It just allows me to say that. That's why we're making that assumption that these values are both zero on the primary income and secondary income balance, and that the totals, the subtotals for the primary income balance and secondary income balance, they come up here and you add them to goods and services, the goods and services balance. Okay, you do that and I can just use the term NX and current account balance interchangeably. So what we've got is we've got a current account balance of minus 50 billion. Now in Australia's case, yeah, we kind of had minus 50 billion around about there, 2009, 2010. So maybe in this diagram, we're modeling the year 2009, 2010, where we had a current account deficit of minus 54 billion, and remember, a trade deficit of minus 54 billion by assumption too. So we're there. And so then we look at this model and we say, well, how can you then get, or what needs to occur for the Australian economy to have a minus $50 billion level of net exports, or a minus $50 billion current account deficit, such as in year 2009, 2010? What do you need to have happen to get that negative value there? The model helps us answer that question. The only way we can have a current account deficit of a current account deficit of 54 billion, or a current account balance of minus 54 billion, is if we have the S minus I line positioned there at minus 50 billion as well. If we had the S minus I line $10 billion further to the right, then the current account deficit would be minus 40 billion. And if we had S minus I $10 billion further to the left, the current account deficit would be 60 billion. The only way we can have net exports and therefore the current account balance being a deficit of 50 billion is if that vertical line is there. In other words, the only way we can get a current account deficit of 50 billion is having a savings minus investment imbalance of 50 billion as well. So once we understand this, we can look at this table again and think to ourselves, well, in 2007, 2008, savings must have been less than total borrowing in Australia to the tune of $74.253 billion. In 2008, 2009, savings must have been less than total borrowing to the tune of $38.78 billion. You get the idea. So what's causing all of these current account deficits? It must be a negative savings investment imbalance. That's the way the model works. So I guess the next question is, well, if that's the case, and that happened from the early to mid 1970s in Australia right through to about 2019 in Australia, a period of 50 odd years of current account deficits, and if it's because savings were less than borrowing in Australia, which led to the current account deficits, why is it that in Australia over the last 50 years, why is it savings were less than investment? Okay, interesting question. What do you think? One way of tackling this question is, well, we know S minus I was negative in Australia. That's what the model tells us. That's the only way you can have a current account deficit. And I'll show you data soon about Australia, which sort of shows you Australia's current account deficit so that you can visualize it. Well, if we've had current account deficits for nearly 50 years, and it's because S has been less than I, so total savings are less than total borrowing, that must mean savings have probably been a little bit on the low side and borrowing has been a little bit on the high side. So why are savings low in Australia? Well, households are the ones that do the majority of saving. So you tell me, why is it that you, your friends and your family save a little bit less than the typical Japanese family, the typical Chinese family, the typical Korean, Taiwanese family, the typical German family? All of the countries I've just mentioned have quite high savings ratios. So that is savings as a percentage of income, whereas yours and your family's savings ratio as a percentage of income is a little bit lower than those countries. So why? You can certainly do a little bit of research about this if you like, but I'll give you a couple of the main reasons. I think part of the reason that Australians save a little bit less than a lot of these other countries is cultural. So there is an acceptance in Australia that debt is okay. If you're borrowing money, you're not saving. You're actually dissaving. So there is sort of this acceptance that it is okay to not save money, but instead borrow it. And that's cultural. I remember hearing someone say a while back, I was at a barbecue, and that person's comment was, life is too short to not have what you want now. And that mentality was quite interesting to me because it meant that person was quite willing to borrow money to obtain what she wanted today rather than save up for it and then buy it when she had the funds to acquire it. Whereas in India, I've been told that the culture is completely different. It's frowned upon in India to borrow money to buy consumable goods, such as a car or holiday. In India, the culture is more save, save, save. Then when you have the money, then you spend it. So that culture in Australia means that we are quite happy to not save, but rather borrow. Second reason why savings may be a little bit low in Australia compared to other countries. If you get sick in Australia, you can use the public health system, Medicare. There's public education, which means if you have children, you don't have to save up a lot of money to pay for their education necessarily. I'm not saying public education's free. Of course, there's fees and there's costs associated with that, but you are getting a subsidy by the taxpayer, and most of your child's education will be paid for by taxpayers if you go to the public education system. When you retire, there's a public pension. So we have a very good public education system and welfare system in Australia, which means there isn't the same urgency to save money in the case of emergency in Australia than some other countries around the world. You talk to people from Singapore, for example, they don't have the same welfare safety net that we have in Australia. So in Singapore, parents will need to save up for their child's education. They'll need to save up in the event that one of or both parents become unemployed. They'll need to save up in the case that a family member gets sick, and they'll need to then pay for medical care. So that means the average Singaporean will save more on a precautionary basis, save more than the typical Australian family, just to protect against those sorts of adverse events like losing a job, becoming sick, etc., etc. And you may also argue that house prices are so high in Australia that it's just impossible to save money. It's impossible for most people to save money after paying rent, after making mortgage repayments. Yep, fair point. So some very good reasons why savings are probably a little bit on the low side compared to those other countries that I mentioned, like Japan, China, Korea, Taiwan, Germany. So then why is borrowing high in Australia? Well, similar to what I was saying before, you are probably more comfortable in borrowing money and spending that money than the typical person living in, say, India for cultural reasons. You'll borrow a lot of money when you buy your first home. So that'll increase borrowing. And what Australia produces is generally quite capital intensive as well. So think about the mining and energy industries in Australia. They are big employers, they account for the bulk of Australia's exports, and they account for quite a lot of GDP. Those industries are very capital intensive. So when we export iron ore, think about all of the capital equipment that is required. And I'm thinking right through to the railway and the port facilities. It's all very capital intensive rather than labor intensive. Compare that to a country such as, well, let's just say a developing country where most of the GDP is accounted for, or more GDP is accounted for by agriculture and low value added manufacturing. There would be a less capital intensive production in a country like that. So less need to borrow money to invest in capital. So some reasons why, compared to other countries and compared to our income, we probably save a little bit on the low side relative to income compared to other countries, and we probably borrow a little bit more relative to income compared to other countries. So that means S is a little bit low in Australia, I is a little bit high. That has given us a negative value of S minus I, let's say to the tune of minus 50 billion. As soon as that line is there, doesn't matter where the NX curve is, it could be there, it could be to the right, it could be to the left. We're still going to have a value of net exports which is equal to minus 50 billion. So in a sense, and it's not quite as simple as this, but it's a good point to make at this stage. As soon as the value of S has been determined by households, and as soon as the level of I has been determined, then we have the position of this green line. And when that has been determined, doesn't matter where the NX curve is, the value of NX is going to be equal to the value of S minus I. So another way of saying that is, as soon as S and I, and therefore the difference between the two, as soon as that value of that variable there has been determined, that then determines the level of net exports. Because you can shift this NX curve left and right, it will move the exchange rate up and down, yes, but the value of NX won't move away from minus 50 billion. So why in Australia have we had current account deficits for nearly 50 years? Because we've had savings investment imbalances, or savings borrowing imbalances more correctly, over those 50 years as well. So because we've run current account deficits, it must reflect a savings investment imbalance. Now, one final point to make. In terms of the flows of money, what is happening here at point A? In terms of the flows of money? Well, at point A, Australia has savings of, let's say, 250 billion, and we have total borrowing of 300 billion, a gap of minus 50 billion. Now, to cover that gap, we need to borrow money, 50 billion of foreigners. So that money comes into the country. As that money comes into the country, we now have domestic savings, some additional foreign savings, which combine to equal the level of domestic borrowing I. But 50 billion has flowed in. But what happens over the course of that same time period, maybe a year, is net exports of minus 50 billion as well. That must mean that exports are less than imports to the tune of $50 billion. X is less than M. Exports bring money into Australia. Imports move money out of Australia. So NX being minus 50 billion means that in terms of the transactions associated with trade, there is a net outflow of money of $50 billion. So at a very high level, what's happening at point A? Because of this savings borrowing imbalance, we are borrowing $50 billion from foreigners. And then through trade, we are sending $50 billion back out of the country as we run this trade deficit in this diagram. So in terms of net foreign investment, we have inward net foreign investment of 50 billion. We borrow $50 billion off foreigners. They then own our bonds and our shares. And then what also happens over the same period of time is we run a trade deficit, which means that we import more than we export. So in a sense, we're paying the $50 billion back to foreigners as we demand very high levels of their goods and services that we import relative to what we export to them. And one final point. When foreigners lend us this $50 billion, they acquire our bonds and our shares. How long do those bonds and those shares last? What is the life of a share? Well, the life of a share is as long as the company keeps operating. And what's the life of a bond? Well, the immediate answer might be 5, 7, or 10 years, and you'd be correct. But if you were a foreigner and you would loan money to Australia by buying an Australian bond, and you held a 10-year bond, at the end of that 10 years, the bond would mature, but you could just reinvest that money and buy a newly issued bond. When that debt is rolled over, you could just buy the bond again. So in that sense, a bond potentially has an infinite life as well. So foreigners are buying our shares and our debt, and that loan, or the loan through the bond, or the share ownership could be in place for decades. Then you ask yourself, well, okay, so that's what foreigners are getting out of this deal. By lending us $50 billion, they are effectively buying our shares or lending us money by buying our bonds. So they have ownership of our assets, and the ownership of that could go on indefinitely for decades and decades. So then what are we getting out of this deal? Well, out of this deal, we're in a situation where in net terms, our imports are greater than our exports to the tune of 50 billion. And let's just focus on those $50 billion worth of imports at the margin. So in a sense, what I'm getting at is exports may be 100 billion, imports 150 billion to give us net exports of 50 billion. What I want you to focus on is what are that last $50 billion worth of imports, what are they likely to be? Well, what do we import from foreigners? Yeah, sometimes we import capital equipment. And that capital equipment could have a life of many years. But we also import a lot of footwear and clothing and holidays, cameras, which might have a life of 5 or 6 years before you throw them out and buy the new technology. See where I'm going with this? When foreigners lend us money, the 50 billion that they lend us in net terms, they own the shares for life. Potentially they can own those bonds for life. But when we have an import imbalance, and we're importing more than we're exporting, the question is, what are we importing? Now, if we're importing capital equipment, which increases the productive capacity of the Australian economy and permanently raises the level of Australian GDP, then maybe that's an okay deal. But if we're borrowing money off foreigners and using that to fund the importation of holidays, electronic equipment that has a life of 2 or 3 years, footwear and clothing, which we may only wear for 1 season, not such a good deal, because the foreigners, they are buying our shares and our bonds and they hold those forever. And what we're doing is we're buying their footwear and clothing, if you want to really be cynical about this, which has a life of maybe 1 or 2 years. Their deal sounds better than our deal. That's the situation we're in. Now, of course, the more that these imports that I've been talking about are capital equipment and lead to productivity improvements in Australia, then it's less of a concern. But if we're borrowing this money off foreigners, $50 billion, and using it to fund imports of clothing, electronic games, other equipment that doesn't increase the productive capacity of the economy, not such a good deal. Okay, and that then sort of leads to the question of whether current account deficits are good or bad. And you have read something about that in topic 5. Okay, so when Australia runs a current account deficit like this of minus $50 billion, just keep in mind that that is a result of inward net foreign investment of $50 billion. That means we are in net terms borrowing $50 billion off foreigners. The question then becomes, what are we doing with that money? If the money is being used for investment spending by companies, not so much of a problem. If it's being used to import capital equipment, not so much of a problem. But if it's being used for clothing, footwear, jet skis, consumables, then we have to sort of think a little bit harder about the situation that we're getting ourselves into as a country. We're borrowing money off foreigners, and if that money is being used on consumables, then perhaps not such a good type of current account deficit.